Welcome to the Ergomy Lunchtime training. By now, you've probably viewed the other 3 introductory videos and are ready to get down to the nuts and bolts of becoming productive with Ergomy. If you're viewing this video in YouTube or another browser-based program, it will be easier to see the on-screen interaction if you switch to full screen mode. To do that, first pause this video. Then, in the lower right-hand corner of the viewer, you should see an icon for full screen mode. Click on that and resume the video. This training will be a bit less formal than the previous videos in that I'll simply be going through a typical user session in Ergomy, describing what I'm doing, and pointing out important features that will help you customize and personalize your experience. As the name implies, we intend for this training to be something that you can do during your lunch hour, still have time to eat, and try out some of the features that we've demonstrated. So let's get started. As we've mentioned previously, the best way to experience Ergomy is with the downloadable client, so that's what I'm using in this demo. If you haven't yet, you can find a link to it under the Ergomy support interest here at the top of the interest tree. Just select either beta users, or if you're viewing this video past the beta period, there'll be a support interest group there, and you can bring up the cards and you'll see where to download the client there. To start, I'll give you some navigational tips for this interest tree in the left pane. There are 3 possible interactions: expanding and collapsing, selecting, and checking. Expanding and collapsing works probably very similar to other hierarchical trees you've worked with before. The little plus sign tells you that there's more underneath that particular title, and then if there are children of children, you can expand those as well, and then you click on the minus sign to collapse things back down. So very familiar paradigm probably for you. Now the second one is select. I can only select one interest at a time, and you'll hear us say on demos and trainings and in our documentation, we'll talk about select and we'll talk about check, and they're 2 different things. When I select, I'm saying I want to act on this interest group in some way, and one of the primary things you'll do is you'll come up here to the edit menu and you'll edit the settings. For example, I can rename the interest, I can add a description, I can tie it to a URL on the web, things like that. I can also delete the interest if it's mine, and in this case college search is a private interest that I set up, and I'll show you how to do that. Or I can add a sub-interest underneath the interest that I have currently selected. You'll also see as we go along that when I have an interest selected, I can do special things over here on the card table that are specifically tied to that interest. Now, unlike select, check is something that I can do on more than one interest at a time. So for example, when I check college search, not only does it select it, does select it, but it also lays out the cards that are associated with that particular interest, the context cards, over here on the card table. I can have more than one selected, or excuse me, checked at a time. So then I'm going to check the physical education. Let's suppose I plan to major in physical education. Now I have the cards from the college search interest group as well as the context cards from the physical education interest group. Kind of a trivial example, but I just wanted to show you that you can have cards from more than one interest checked and shown on the card table at one time. Now there is a practical limitation to how many cards you want to have on the table at a time, and we think it's somewhere between 3 and 5 main cards. Now I obviously have more than that when you have them stacked like this, but we're talking about top level cards or piles. So basically you want about 5 piles or fewer on your card table at a time. And there's 2 reasons for this. One, you'll just find that the screen real estate will become more difficult. You'll be scrolling around a lot. And also, the purpose of knowledge preservation is to store knowledge and use knowledge in a way that's easily found and easily retrieved later. And when you've got that many cards on the table, it's probably not a narrow enough context that you've built or that you've put together for yourself to really be that useful. So probably you're only going to have 2 or 3 at a time. However, the fact of the matter is you can have as many interest groups as you want checked at a time. Now, it's helpful to note that the interest tree is a hierarchy to enable a more convenient way to browse the topics. Remember, I showed you this. However, you'll also notice that each of the interest groups stands on its own. So, for example, if I check education, which is the parent of all these other interest groups, notice that it doesn't check them as well. And that's different from some other interactions you've probably used with hierarchical checking and unchecking. Each of these does stand alone. It is autonomous. It's just a visual cue to help you browse through the various topics. Now let me show you how to manage and personalize your view of this interest tree even more. And then the context under each interest will be able to manage those as well. When you become an Ergomy member, you're automatically subscribed, as you've probably noticed, to a really large number of interests, and that number will probably increase as time goes on. If you'd like to pare down that list and not show as many interests at one time and have just a smaller interest tree, you can easily do that by coming up here to subscriptions, and that window will then show you a replicate version of these interests in a tree. But then you have the option to uncheck and check to subscribe and unsubscribe from the various interest groups. So that's an option that you have if you want to pare this tree down a little bit. This user interface right here, the interest group subscriptions, is also used if you want to search the other interests that you're either subscribed to or not subscribed to for certain search terms. So you can find content that's already been saved and created. And so it's a part of our knowledge preservation project is that we hope that one day people will actually be searching the Ergomy interest group tree instead of a traditional search. They'll start with that and then maybe turn to the search engines to build on the knowledge that's stored in Ergomy. Until you've become an Ergomy author, you're in what amounts to view-only mode for most of these interest groups that you're subscribed to. I'm going to show you in a minute how to set up your own. But even though you can't directly contribute content to an interest, in other words, you can't add cards to it or add publications to the cards that are there, you can still personalize your experience of each interest by determining which of the context you want to show or hide on the card table. And I'm going to use geography for our example. So I check the geography box, and it's going to display two cards currently on the table. But if I come up here, notice that geography is selected and checked. So it's checked to put the cards on the table. It's selected so I can act on it. I come up here to context and I can view context of the geography interest. And notice that there are actually 5 context cards currently in this interest group, but I only have 2 checked to show. So I can manage which ones I want to see and don't want to see, and it doesn't affect anybody else. It only affects me. So for example, if I decide that I want to see a card, you may have seen that card, it'll go away when I check it or uncheck it. I'll check it again and uncheck it again, so you can see it go away over here. So I can decide which cards, when I choose to look at that interest group, which ones I want to see on my card table. Now I chose this one specifically because I wanted to take a little side trip and talk about the Ergomy lexicon, which includes many senses of words that you may think of as being all the same, but in many cases there's nuanced definitions that when you get down to really the nitty-gritty of some knowledge projects, it may be important to you to use a particular sense of the word that is slightly different from the others. Now these are really subtle, I admit that, but I wanted you to see that we do have this in the lexicon and in the hierarchy. So for example, the word government can mean the organization that's governing a particular political unit or community, and we refer to that as the government. For example, the government reduced taxes, the government was about to shut down, the government this, the government that, and so forth. We can also have government as something you do, the act of governing. You can engage in government. You can have a system, which is a government, for example, a democratic government, a communist government, a tyrannical government, and so forth. Again, very subtle. And then you can also study government, just like you study political science, biology, English, you can study government. So I just wanted to take that little side note and show you how you can really get down to some pretty good detail when we talk about context setting in Ergomy. Now, in addition to the show and hide, I can take it to an additional level and basically archive a card as well. Now, that's not so important when you only have 5 cards in the interest group, but imagine if you had 25 cards. When you have 25 cards, there may be some that you just don't want to see except when you go looking through the archive for them. And a really good example of that is for time-sensitive knowledge. So let's say that you've built a private interest group, or you've participated in a subscription interest group that is focused on a current election. Once that election is over, you don't want to lose that knowledge that you've saved, but you don't really want to see it every time you come into this particular view. And so I can set it as inactive, and then when I view it, I can hide the inactive. See how when I click on the hide inactive, that one that I had checked went away. So it's just another level of archiving, and it's just another level of organization that you have access to. And as time goes on and more content is added to Ergomy, it's going to become important that you have these tools to be able to manage the volume of knowledge that's available to you.